Hello, welcome to episode 37 of Let the Story Write Itself. I'm Sarah, and I am the founder of Sarah Fair, which is a brand all about encompassing your true self and your most sovereign self, your surrendered self, essentially. Today's episode, I'm talking about my own personal transformation and journey going from veiled to fractured to sovereign. Essentially, it's the breakdown of all the moving parts that occurs over many, many years. For me, it was over like a decade. And in that in that time period, it's really like a map that you're writing yourself. And sometimes you don't even realize what's going on moving forward until you look at it reflecting, as I say, like hindsight is 2020. And that's where that trust comes in because going forward, it's that free fall, it's that act of faith, it's that feeling that you don't necessarily know. It's going into the unknown, right? So it's only looking back at it, that I really am able to almost package it to figure out like, oh, these were the stages that I went through. These are the parts. I can even put labels on it, if you will. So here I am for simplifying it essentially, this transformation journey that really took part, it's obviously just my life. It kind of took part in messy ways. It wasn't so neat and simple and like I know exactly what I'm doing as I was just going through it, right? No, it's definitely way more messy than that. But looking back on it now and retelling it and be like, oh, well, that's kind of how the journey unfolded, then I'm able to be like, oh, you know what? I'm calling this the evolution of self-trust. This is going from veiled to fractured to sovereign. And it sounds like so neat and tidy like that, right? Like there's a bow on top of this neatly wrapped package now. But let me just say that as with real life, the life situation does not occur so neatly packaged with a bow on top. But that is also why we like to listen to stories of people who have been there, done that, or who just lived through the messy experience of it all, who got through to the other side, because we see, like, well, either you can like sidestep whatever they went through, or simply collapse the time, or even find a shorter way to get from A to B than the person who kind of just lived that experience, right? And that's kind of the gift that every human has. Every human has lived through their own experience. That looking in hindsight, that's called your experience essentially. That's what you look back in hindsight and that you can now wrap up with a pretty bow now that you have been through it. Now that you have actually lived through it, you're like, oh, well, that's what happened. And suddenly, whatever a decade of experience, 2 decades, 3 decades, whatever, a lifetime of experiences, suddenly you're able to extract the wisdom, the gems, the pieces that actually can have value for somebody. And that is the whole point of sharing your story, of speaking aloud, of writing, of essentially reflecting so that you can understand your own journey and the fact that you're able to give voice to it, to give a form of expression to it, and give that as a gift to somebody essentially, because that gift is so invaluable. That is priceless. That's like if you almost were able to go back and meet your younger self, your past self, the self that had not been through that journey yet. Imagine, like, I don't know if there's anyone who would not want to meet the self that they are now when they were younger and be like, how did you go through it? What happened? Like, what did you do in this time? And even be like, what would you advise me to do or to not do if if you had you as you are now go back to meet your younger self, whether that's a decade ago or 2 decades ago or even just like a week ago, that's almost like time traveling, right? That's essentially being able to read into the future before it occurs. Okay, that's just like magical. That's like a sense of otherworldly, kind of like beyond supernatural power that I think that essentially you get to have when you hire a mentor, when you hire a coach, even when you just learn from other people, and you yourself, when you are able to tap into your own experiences and that wisdom and that nugget of that core truth, essentially. And, while you are not able to necessarily go back and rewrite your past, I do actually believe that everything that you have lived essentially is still writing itself. Like it's still part of your story. If you're still alive, you are still writing your story, and anything that has occurred is still like it's still up in the air in that sense. Like, yes, the past in some objective form, it has already occurred. You can't necessarily change certain things that have already happened, but in going forward into the future, everything that has happened can actually form a new meaning based on how you live now going into the future, if that makes sense. So, what I mean by this, if this is not really making sense more concretely, is that just say you're in the if you're currently like just whatever, looking at your past and be like, okay, not really giving it any special attention, you might not actually extract the wisdom to its full potential, to its maximized, to the maximum. And and so your future, your present is not going to have the same oomph, the same impact that it could very well have. Whereas if you were to take that same past and look at it with the perspective of everything here has value, everything here, there is a teaching lesson here. There is something in here that actually is worth like a million quadrillion dollars that, doesn't even have a price value. It's priceless information that someone could actually use to better their life, to even just like to shortcut their life to something from A to B to get to doing what you are able to do, but without all that hoo-ha in between. Because that's almost like that's the magic of your story, that you are like the explorer, charting those uncharted waters essentially, like Christopher Columbus essentially, like charting new lands. It's like the map is not even written. You are that brave soul, that adventurer on the high seas, the unknown waters of life essentially. The treacherous seas, and you go through it all. You go through all of the whole adventure of it all. And, you get smacked about, or, who knows what is like happened to you during that time, but you like those hard won lessons essentially that is not so pretty or fun while you're in it. But when you're looking back on it, yeah, sure, you can tie that pretty ribbon on it, right? And that's kind of like that invaluable experience that every single human has. If they were to actually look at their history and their past and their whole life essentially as this journey of there is magic and power in what you have lived that actually, when shared, has the potential to transform another person's life and their whole journey as well. And so it's really worth it to look into it more deeply and to even consider working with a mentor yourself, because every person has a different set of lived experiences. It's almost like this divine blueprint that only you, your unique self, you're a one of one. There is nobody else in the world who has the exact same life of you. Even if you're a twin of somebody, you both have different experiences just by way of you being different people, okay? So now wanted to really get into the meat and bones of this episode, which is about, what I have wrapped up nice and neatly now, and that I'm still exploring. I'm still exploring, and essentially, I'm just talking about over and over and over again because this is almost like the core of my story. This is the sovereign journey. This is the evolution of self trust. This is going from veiled to fractured to sovereign. So, what do I mean by veiled? If you've been listening to any part of my story or know any part of my journey so far, you'll know that at 17, I had this glimpse of, or even just like this voice come through quite clearly. Go travel. I was standing at orientation at the university I was about to embark on like a 4-year degree at, and I had this thought come to me so clearly, but quietly. It was just like this intuitive nudge. And, being 17, it was like such a far-fetched thought. I'm waiting for my mom to pick me up. I live at home. I'm going to university in my hometown. I never like lived on my own, never gone anywhere on my own, quite sheltered essentially. Okay. I never even consciously had this desire. I never had like a bucket list. I'm like, oh, I really want to go here. I really want to go there. Right. So it just did not make any logical sense. Yet it was so clear. It was just like this distinct impression, go travel. And of course, my feelings were telling me, my bodily reactions was like I was feeling hollow inside, just this feeling of emptiness. I literally had this impression as I was sitting in one of the lecture rooms during the orientation day. I feel like I'm in jail, okay? That was already signs like bodily wisdom telling me this is not the right path for you. Like you are not feeling the vibe. Like very much I applied, and it was definitely not like a soul-led decision in going to university or applying or whatever. It was not a calling, okay? So, no doubt there would be a certain level of confusion or even just a lack of clarity, but in this veiled state, this is where it's like I don't even know it. I don't even know that I what I don't know essentially. It's veiled. It's like this feeling of like, okay, there's something that's not quite right, but it's like I'm not even aware that you know what? This is intuition speaking to me. That intuitive voice is guiding me. So even though I know how I feel, like I'm even open to downloads, like I got this download to go travel. So it's like my channels are open to receive messages, but there's this veil that is where I'm disconnected from that truth. So it's like I may hear it, I may feel it, there may be glimpses of it, impressions, nudges, but I don't even know what to do with. I don't even know what it means. I'm not even necessarily aware. It's like I'm I'm not fully there, if that makes sense. Like there's a certain disconnection from that soul aspect, from that, I don't even think I necessarily even use those words in the past. I would never use like soul led or intuitive or, guidance or whatnot. I would never even use those words in that sense. So even though there's like a spark within, it's not fully developed, it's not even fully cognizant. It's veiled. And so this is what it means when you're in the veiled state. It's that disconnection. It's even though there's a call within, say the inner calling to travel, to explore, to live my truth, despite that clear yearning inside and that clear feeling of not being in the right place at the right time when I was like just, on the campus at university, there was this disconnect in that feeling of empowerment of like, okay, well, what do I do? Because I didn't do anything. I just went through the motions still, and I didn't necessarily take action and be like, "Oh, you know what? I'm just gonna withdraw. This is not the path for me." That would be an empowered state, right? Which at 17, I was not necessarily in. So I kind of, didn't even consciously like dismiss the idea of travel. It was just more something that didn't even necessarily get through to my conscious mind. So it was very much like this. Yes, I got through to my conscious mind, but it didn't get through to the point where I was actually going to be like, well, let me take action on it, if that makes sense. So this is the state of being still in a state of being in the veiled state. So now I wanted to explain more about the fractured state, which is that in between moment. And this really did not necessarily occur. I mean, yeah, if you're really going to nitpick, you could be like, well, there was a bit of fractured state when you were 17 because it was like pieces of you were coming through that wanted you to choose it, but you weren't. So that could be argued. But I will say that the fractured state really kind of really was more fully at the time I finished university because I finished university just because I guess I was too cowardly, you could just say, because I didn't bother to make a decision. I was like, I'm just gonna let this play out. You know what? I don't even want to walk away. So by default, I made the decision by not making a decision. So ended up just, year after year going and completing this degree, even though within I always had this feeling of disconnect and feeling like I am not doing what I really want to do right now. So finally, I graduate and I don't even want to get a job. I don't even want to go into the field because I'm obviously, in a way, exhausted on a soul level. I'm like, geez, Louise, that was some kind of torture. Okay. Like on the surface, it's like, what am I tortured about? It's like I got driven to school every day. It's a beautiful campus. I'm living at home for many aspects. Like I have a very like lovely life, I, you know, never had to work while I was in university. I was always just doing what I wanted in a sense, but it wasn't fulfilling on a soul level. So that's where that feeling of like, when I say I felt tortured, I'm like, what the heck do you mean? On a surface level, you'd be like, okay, but you actually have a lot of things. Like, what are you talking about? But there's that feeling of like, I felt like I went through it because I was not even, I was discontented on a soul level, okay? And if you know what I mean, if you feel that feeling of like there's something missing, there's just that je ne sais quoi that you just can't, it's like you can't even tangibly put your finger on it. That's that's the part where that's that missing piece. That's the part where it's almost that self-actualization piece. It's like when you have everything else, you have all of your basic needs met and even and more than that, you want to be your most self-actualized self. You want to grow into your full potential. And that's where, if you're not doing it, you might feel this great sense of dissatisfaction that you can't necessarily explain tangibly, that people might think you're, just like have nothing else to complain about or something. But it's quite profound because, your soul is a big part of who you are. And I think sometimes people don't give this enough credit or attention in the first place. And that could be also a function of being in the veiled state, that it's like you're not so aware of your inner desires, of your true self, of that soul that is wanting to come through more fully. So essentially, in the fractured state, I am now more fully aware of the fact of how important it is to be aligned with your soul self. So at this point, I'm like, I am not doing that again. That was not cool. So I enrolled myself into a psychotherapy program. And it's in this time that I start using my voice more, I start connecting more with the truth of what I have to say from a just like from my heart, from my soul, from my personal experiences. And I'm not just speaking like information or like, you know, you know, talking more on a knowledge level or just like things that I read on a book. I'm talking about my personal lived experiences, my emotions, my thoughts, my feelings, things that actually I realized I never really got to speak that fully or truly ever, even at home, because that just was not really something that you know, even if I was speaking my truth at home, it didn't feel like it was being like received, if that makes sense. It was just like kind of falling on deaf ears or just like, it's just the sense that, in psychotherapy, I realized I'm like, you know what? This is the first time that I feel like people aren't talking back at me or like kind of pushing against what I'm saying and just kind of accepting what I'm saying and listening, if that makes sense. And also encouraging me to speak more from my heart rather than just from an analytical place, which I realized a lot of times people do, and that I do a lot, had done a lot as well, and sometimes default to, where it's like you try to make sense of how you feel instead of just feeling it. It's kind of like that idea that you're thinking more about it than just feel it doing it, if that makes sense. So this fractured state was really about me then having to unravel from that state that I was that went through university, that like that old identity and whatever shadows and patterns that was like somehow, whether it was like fear to step out on my own, lack of self-trust, placing more emphasis on what other people thought. It was really kind of, I had this great desire to become more of my own person. I that was something I was saying a lot. It's like I don't feel like I'm my own person. So this fractured state was really this messy process of like breaking free from that part of me that was still almost like little girl of like I am not quite my own person, even though I've completed a university degree. Somehow that degree in itself was that symbol, that representation that I was not free, that I was not my own self. And so, that call within that I never took. So now I was kind of going through how, the fear, the confusion, the lack of self-trust, it kind of kept me in that cycle of doing something that wasn't really truly aligned for me. And there was like that feeling of self-doubt and like I didn't fully trust myself. So there's a feeling of powerlessness. It was the feeling of being disconnected from what I really felt. And even if I knew what I felt, it was disconnected from have feeling power, having the power or feeling empowered enough to take the action. So it felt like I was just on autopilot, essentially. It felt like I was just there in body, but not in mind, not in spirit. And so there's this shift that began to happen. It was like kind of breaking free from the veiled state, from this veil, starting to reclaim my authority of my own life, being more the authority, the driver of my own life, and beginning to move more into that state of sovereignty. So can you see the difference between the veiled state and the fractured state? The veiled state is like I I am just kind of in that state where I'm feeling disconnected, but I don't know what to do with it. I don't even necessarily know fully why I feel that way at that time. I just know that I didn't feel that good. But for whatever reason, even though like on the surface it seemed like, well, why would I not? Why can't I just enjoy myself? Why can't I just put things aside and be like, you know what? I'm in university. Just let me go through this as best as I can. Why do I constantly have this feeling of disconnect and lack of fulfillment essentially on that soul level? Like, why do I feel so tortured essentially? So the shift really happened once I got out of that space. This is such the importance of like, you can't really start to become a new person when you're constantly in the same environment, when you're still doing the things that are keeping you in that state. So even though I didn't actually choose it and I kind of just like completed the degree, once I completed the degree and I didn't have to constantly go to, the university, the lectures, immersing myself in that activity, they're just kind of like keeping me in that cycle and not even giving me the space to really just be a different way. So finally, when I finished that, it was like this breath. I felt like a sigh of relief. I was like, oh my God, thank God that was done, essentially. I mean, it sounds a bit comedic, but it really felt like I was just like, "Whew, oh my God." It felt like I had held my breath for like those whole 5 years I was in university, essentially. And now it's just like letting out a sigh of relief, like, okay, got like finished that. That is off my plate now, but now what? So you can see almost like this feeling of like I never really intended to use that degree towards anything in particular. It was just this feeling of like just get this done. So I feel like I can say I just did it, but I didn't. So it really had this sense of disempowerment to it. And then when I completed it and now I'm like feeling like, okay, what do I choose now? Now it was like unraveling because it's like there's part of me that was still like in the matrix. I'm like, well, I need to find employment or maybe I need to go study something else. There's this still this sense of like grasping onto the old identity of like being a student, being an employee, doing certain things just because that's like the model of society that you see. And it wasn't necessarily about like, okay, but what is that self-trust within you calling you to? What is that unknown, that sense of adventure calling you? This is where you become like that sense of sovereignty is calling you forth. And for me, I mean, it very, very much looks like entrepreneurial ventures because if I'm getting that call and it's not necessarily on like, it's more like this open-ended adventure. It's a sense of like, okay, well, the path isn't really written. It's like I don't even know like what am I moving into. So that's where, you know, because there's not a tangible, it's not like a syllabus. It's not just like this written plan that you're like, okay, step one, then two, then three. Because there's not that clearly laid out route. And maybe if you don't necessarily have someone who is guiding you in that sense, you might feel that sense of lack of self-trust where you're like, well, I have no idea what this other path is. So even though you have a call to it, there's that certain sense of doubt. You're like, well, what is it? And you're not necessarily trained to be in your full explorer self mode. Probably like the natural instincts you have as a child, just simply exploring and going about and doing things. But now there's a certain structure that you're feeling like there is no structure because essentially you have to create that for yourself. It's like recognizing yourself as a creator, right? And that's a sovereign, that pull to that sovereignty. So in this fractured state, there's a lot of exploration. For me, it looked like wandering from like I had like a cycle of over 16 different jobs during this like a short 2-year period. I was just trying so many different things. I had many volunteer activities as well. I started even just combing through my own hometown and city as like a fine-tooth comb, and I pulled away from having being driven everywhere. So I started going about and out and about on my own, and then I also got my own driver's license at this time. So whether I was exploring on foot or bicycle or public transportation or driving, I just started getting out and about a lot more on my own. And, you all this just like a solo journey where I started seeking out like healing practices. So I went like acupuncture and Reiki and flower essences and massage therapy and, even psychology and counseling and all sorts of just different. And I started learning about different methodologies and ideologies and started reading more. Very much I was always reading things along the lines of, say, Eckhart Tolle. I had read some books on, and then there was also like Abraham Hicks. I was called, started finding out more, and conversations with God, and just so many different readings and teachings. And I still loved reading like my Archie comics and Agatha Christie books and fiction novels for sure, but I was also definitely very much on a path of expanding more into spirituality in that sense. And I was even led to Vipassana 10-day retreat, meditation retreat during this time. So I never locked myself to any one employment or path of career, and I never even really tried to use my degree at this time because I very much recognized that I there was a certain truer sense of self that I was trying to get back to essentially. And at some point I started becoming more fit. I started riding my bicycle more. I went for like 2 to 3 hour bike rides. I started going on more solo travels, venturing further, whether it was like, you know, places in within my home province or even getting outside the province to other provinces within the country. And it was really this time that I then even moved to a city on my own, and I then got this idea. I'm like, maybe I want to do life coaching, and I enrolled myself in a life coaching program. And then at this time, it was really like 2015 to 2016 that somehow eventually it was through these choices that was more in line with listening through this whole process. It was definitely a decade, like from the time I finished high school. It was 2005 to around 2015. I was now living on my own in a new city. I enrolled myself in a life coaching program, which really stemmed more from like my own intuitive desire rather than just like willy-nilly applying to some program in my hometown university. And I also have been traveling a lot more on my own and just venturing to different places and really developing that connection with my own true self more and more, and you know elevating my spirits in that sense, like that sense of personal vibration, if that makes sense. There's this vibrational scale that you're in where you go from a state of like more, say, self-doubt, and then maybe more self-trust, and then to the point where you become more just living in a state of joy and abundance and ease in a more free flow state. So I was definitely, by the time I was like 25, 26, this was like nearly a decade now since I had been 17, just before university. I really went through this whole process of reclaiming my true self and developing that connection with myself. And suddenly it's like through that whole process, I realized I'm like, well, I didn't realize it at the time, but I had shifted my state in such a way that I now had this idea to go to Toronto. And this is where that start of that train journey went, where I finally listened to that voice, where I didn't listen to that voice at 17 that told me to go travel. I listened to that voice now. This was just at the beginning of 2016 where I got this new voice. And it was very similar to that voice at 17. But obviously now as a decade older, had a whole lot more experiences, was more in my sovereign state of self. And what really transitioned me from that fractured state to the sovereign self was that new identity that I had finally become, where I now, in choosing to say yes, it was like the proof in the pudding, where I now said yes to the thing that I could not say yes to a decade earlier. And I took the train ride and I walked away from the coaching program and I walked away from the city I had just moved to on my own. And I walked away from like the things that even though looked good on the surface, I'm like, yeah, there's still something here that's pulling me to more. And it was that mimicking that same experience of like, okay, there's a call. And now this time, the call within won over the limiting beliefs. I no longer, even though there was some fear and feelings of like the unknown, excitement was greater than the fear at this point. Had moved more into my sovereign self, where joy and abundance and self-trust was the norm over the limiting beliefs. And that's why it was able to win out over the voice that, you know, over over the fact that I hadn't developed that to that extent when I was 17. So it was like it was not the balance scale was not outweighed in my favor to choose the inner voice at that time. Whereas now it's like because I had cultivated so much more abundance and joy and that deeper self-trust in 2000, by the time it was 2016 and I got the call, like the very similar call again, that was able to outweigh anything else that might have been holding me back. And I said yes. And it was in that moment that I really embodied my sovereign state. So, do you see how this whole journey went from veiled to fractured to sovereign? There's this whole messy in between of like, okay, I had a call within and I somehow didn't choose it. What the heck happened there? That veiled state, right? That corresponded to my university career, to the fractured, me moving out of university and now just going through the whole doing life kind of thing. But instead of just doing life, it was really more me reclaiming myself and who I really was. And at some point, it's like the scales tipped into my favor. The tipping point where the scales were no longer balanced. It was definitely balanced more towards excitement and joy and freedom and all of that energy that really is what outweighed anything else that might have held me back from not choosing the adventure that, essentially was at my doorstep at in January 2016 that led me to embark on this 4-day train ride across from Vancouver to Toronto. And then Toronto, I went over to Barcelona in Spain and then led me to Morocco and on and on and on this over 1 year solo journey around the world. Very spontaneous, serendipitous, um, sovereign journey essentially. It was me in my sovereign state. And because that whole fractured realm that I went through, that I moved through, that messy in between state, that was the reclamation of my true self and is the tipping point that then, when the time came, allowed me to say yes to that more sovereign state of being, and was the reason why I was able to go on the solo travel that I did. So it wasn't even about the travel per se, as it was in that moment, the decision where I said yes. It was that one pivotal moment that was the clear indicator that I had become a new person compared to the person that I was at 17. So hopefully this is like has become like quite clear what it means you know, when I say the journey of transformation from the veiled to the fractured to the sovereign, and how that can express itself as different life experiences, from being a university student to moving from the in between of like a young adult to finally being going on over a year long solo travel journey state where, I was living more in a state of truth. And the whole point is that the fractured self is not necessarily wrong. It's simply a phase of, for me, it was deep experimentation and growth. It was a stage where I began to see that my life isn't in alignment with an inner truth, but I'm also not necessarily like in that full truth or what that looks like yet. So there's still glimpses of it. And it's through this tension that the transformation happens because it's like, I'm not going back there. I'm not going back to the student at university that I was that felt so like torture, but I'm also not quite sure what exactly it means to be in alignment with my full truth. So that's the fractured self. The whole point of this is that sovereignty also is not a destination because it's not the particular places that I went in particular on my solo travel journey. It was the constant evolving process of becoming. And even now, a decade even later, and it now being 37, 2 decades since I was 17, it's still about becoming. It's still about knowing that while I'm always whole, that I'm always whole. I'm still whole, even when life feels messy or uncertain. There's always a new journey that you're stepping into. So while I may be operating in a state of greater sovereignty than I had in my younger years, there's still always transformation. And, in the transformation process, you not only transform yourself, but you also are able to guide and inspire transformation for others around you. So, I encourage you to take a moment today to check in with your intuition. What is the next step that you're being guided to take? And, remember that your story is always writing itself. So, you stay present, you stay aligned, and you watch, you allow your true purpose to unfold. I want to thank you for listening to today's episode. And if you're ready to explore your own transformation, I invite you to take the first step, whether that's you can work with me for a single session or a deeper container where I'm here to guide you through your own journey to sovereignty. And as I referenced at the beginning, you can totally collapse time. It doesn't have to take you a decade, 2 decades. You don't necessarily have to go through the whole messy process that I did. Yes, it will be messy, but you can do it so much cleaner in the sense of going from A to B in a much shorter time frame with a much more with much more certainty and clarity just by the fact of having a mentor and a guide by your side who has lived the experiences. So also don't forget to take the realm quiz. The realm quiz is on my Instagram, Sarah Fair, where you can discover where you're at in on your journey. So until the next episode, trust yourself and let your own story write itself. In the next episode, I'll be exploring the art of embodying your deeper truth more fully and the tools that you can use to channel your purpose into action. So stay tuned for next episode, which will be a deeper dive into the energetic side of leadership. And that is episode 37 of Let the Story Write Itself.